Then I saw the Oppenheimer film and I walked out of that movie and I thought, I want to scream on the steps. Yes. I just want to say, this is such rubbish. It's so fraudulent. We understand him. It's got to be about America. It's got to be about an American in trouble, an American developing things. It wasn't.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. There are some Australians whose achievements are so extraordinary, so world-changing, that it seems almost implausible they've slipped from our collective memory. So Mark Oliphant is one of them. Born in Adelaide to modest means, Oliphant became one of the 20th century's great scientific pioneers, a man who, through brilliance and persistence, helped unlock the energy of the atom, developed the radar that saved lives in the Second World War, and gave Oppenheimer the decisive push towards the bomb. He was, as author Roland Perry puts it in his remarkable new biography, the Australian genius who changed the course of history. And yet, how often do we speak of him? Why don't Australians celebrate Oliphant as they do Monash or Howard Florey? Perhaps it's because his legacy forces us to confront rather uncomfortable truths about science and morality, about invention and destruction, and about the strange dance between idealism and power in the nuclear age. Well, joining me today on Afternoon Light is Roland Perry, who will discuss his new book, Oliphant, and give us a glimpse of the man who was at once a visionary, a moralist, a rebel, and at times a contradiction. Welcome, Roland.
Good summary. Thank you very much, Georgina.
And I'm pleased we've made it clear, unlike others that you've been interviewed by, that we're talking about Mark Oliphant and not Robert Oppenheimer. So, this is interesting, though. You've written a book about a really significant Australian scientist, a pioneer scientist, whose contribution in some respects might have exceeded Oppenheimer's, and yet Oppenheimer...
It did exceed Oppenheimer's by a long, long way.
And Oppenheimer gets the movie, the book...
$1 billion worth of movie. Biggest selling war movie ever, Oppenheimer.
So we're righting the wrongs here today, and you've obviously done a significant amount of work to right that wrong with your book. But tell me, who was Mark Oliphant?
Yes. He's easily now, you mentioned Florey, he's number 2 Florey in our history as a scientist. Mark Oliphant is number 1 by a long way. The number 1 achiever. You just don't say the greatest, he's the number 1 achiever because, as you say, he developed radar which saved the Brits from being absolutely pulverised by the German Luftwaffe in World War II. Then he turned it into a war weapon, so from a defensive weapon. Now, when I say he, as if, were any other people? Of course, but he was the driving force always and had the brain on the science to develop these things. So he said, put all the discs along the spine of England, stop the Luftwaffe, we'll see them first. Then he said, now, why don't we make an attack weapon, put them in the planes with short wave, that's microwave, and see them before they see us and destroy them that way. So you get the planes up in the air. Now, that really saved Britain, there's no question. So that's one achievement, massive achievement. And then the second one was actually creating the atomic bomb. Now, when I say creating, he was the one that pushed it when every other major scientist at that time, we're talking about Oppenheimer, we're talking about Einstein, Max Born, Niels Bohr, and a guy called George Thomson from the Cavendish, the UK. So all the great scientists said, can't be done. You need 100 tons. And Oliphant, this is where he distinguishes himself from everyone else, was the great experimenter. He couldn't wait to get into the lab to fire deuterium bullets, deuterium or uranium, to find out what the reaction was. And as he said, medicine, he was going to start studying medicine at Adelaide, and he said, it's rote. You just learn by rote. And that's true. You have to say what the skeleton looks like, what the muscles are like, how it operates, all operates. That was rote to him. That was too easy and not challenging. What he wanted to do was discover new things by experimenting. And he didn't get into Adelaide medicine. He wanted to start there. He didn't get a scholarship. You had to have a scholarship in those days.
So let's talk about his upbringing. So he's from Little Old Adelaide, which is a place
with
familiar
4 brothers,
to me.
A bit of an odd parental background. His father, Baron, was a strange fellow. He loved the Russian Revolution and wanted Mark to be a priest. Of the 5 boys he had, he was allegedly the brightest. No one can know, of course. He was the eldest. And he wanted him to be a priest, which is just amazing stuff. And that was a pressure on Oliphant early. The religious thing was a pressure. But he was a left-leaning, Labor-supporting baron in a lowly job in government, and he wanted his sons to all excel, particularly Mark, and he wanted to push him in to the priesthood. I shouldn't laugh, but it wasn't right for Mark.
Right.
Okay, so
yes.
he had other dreams, and I think you'll love this, of course. He met a 13-year-old beauty, and she stabilised him. She said, you can do what you want. I'll be there with you all the way. It was a fantastic relationship. He was only 15.
Oh.
The parents approved, and that was a big part of keeping him on the right track in a way, because he was a little bit of a bully, not braggadocious, but he had an inclination. He was very masculine because he had 4 brothers and it was rough and tumble. And here's a woman comes and says, well, there's other things in life like dancing. He was a good dancer. So they got on very well. And she stuck with him right through the life. It was a fantastic break for him. He acknowledged all that, of course.
And this was Rosa.
Rosa.
Yeah.
Lovely Rosa. But he didn't get into Adelaide.
No. This is amazing to think of someone who really is obviously so bright.
So bright.
But, I mean, why didn't he get into Adelaide University?
Well, he just wouldn't have his heart in what was put up to him. There are some people like that who've got to have passion. He got a job at the State Library as a cadet, and then he moved across to the physics department, and that was the big break. He suddenly got fascinated, and here he was at 18 trying to see if he could get a reaction by firing electrons at yellowcake, which is inert uranium.
Is that how he ended up getting into Adelaide University then?
Yes, that was his way in.
Because he worked as a jeweller, hadn't he?
He worked as a jeweller all the time after he didn't get into university. He had to earn money, so he worked and he made a beautiful gold wedding ring for Rosa. His father had given him a small nugget, and he managed to hone it into something. So he was very good with his hands as well, which is quite unusual for an intellect like his. But he managed to get his way into the physics department, which was the break. Because there he was, suddenly, he knew that things were going on in Cambridge, and he knew that this was the big new field, splitting the atom. So here he was with yellowcake, which is just the inert uranium you dig up in the dirt all over Australia, and he was trying to get reactions. He just got puffs of wind, nothing at that point, but he was very determined to follow through and all that.
And was he doing this as an undergraduate student as well?
Well, what happened was when he did the cadetship, it eased him into the degree course. Uh-huh. And he went along to a lecture by Lord Rutherford, the great English Kiwi, if you like. He'd been in England 40 years, came and lectured in Melbourne. And
he was a nuclear physicist himself.
He was the greatest at that point.
Yes.
And so he had about 20 Nobel laureates under him, and he was an experimenter as well. And Oliphant was absolutely enchanted, even though, as he said, he'd go to put something on the blackboard and he'd forget what he was putting up there, mumble a bit, and he couldn't communicate that well. But the enchantment for Oliphant was off the charts because he thought, this is what I want to do. I want to split atoms. So he very shrewdly did a paper on mercury, which no one had done, and that got him in front of Rutherford at Cambridge, and he got a scholarship to go in 1927.
Right, so this was to do his postgraduate studies at Cambridge. I mean, in Australia, was nuclear physics being studied at all in the early part of the 20th century?
No. The first awakening, really, I mean, they knew about it. They knew what was happening. Everyone knew what was happening at Cambridge, at the Cavendish, under Rutherford. But we didn't have departments looking at nuclear physics. It just wasn't on at that stage. But his brain was into it straight away. And he got under Rutherford, and Rutherford loved him because he was an experimenter. He couldn't wait to get in the lab. He got knocked over a couple of times, electrocuted, with the soles of his shoes stuck to the floor, out on his back. Rutherford rushes in. Everyone thinks he's dead. They revive him. He's up the next day.
They didn't have a Clipsal safety switch there, clearly.
No.
So what was Mark Oliphant's relationship with, I guess, Rutherford was his mentor, wasn't he?
Yes, it became almost father and son. It was a great affinity. A lot to do with them both being Antipodeans and having Antipodean wives. And they all got on as a sort of family unit. Personally, go in the countryside together. He just adored Oliphant because he was the white-haired boy that he hadn't had himself, and he just thought, this is the one that's going to be my successor. Even though they were politically opposed, Oliphant was more left-wing and Rutherford's conservative. He used to rubbish Oliphant about his love of the New Statesman and some of the left-wing papers and say, get a life sort of thing, read something more general. But they got on extremely well, and that was a big step for Oliphant that he got on so well.
Was Oliphant's politics a big part of his life? I mean, we know through the story of Oppenheimer, who was also very left wing, that is very problematic.
Yes,
of
very
course,
is the extra
the
word
Cold
there.
War.
Oliphant, as a reaction to his old man thumping him with religion and the afterlife, he was obsessed with the afterlife, Baron, which would be a bit off-putting for anyone, but he was. And Oliphant, the whole concept of ideology wasn't really important to him. He was into physics, experimenting. But he went into that milieu in Cambridge, which was all left. All the poor little rich boys were going to save the country by bringing up the working class. All that went on. Marxism was huge. Russia was the panacea, the great nation. And he fell into that, but he was more naive about things. He just wanted to get in the lab. But he was mixing with Rothschild, who was a lord eventually, a few years later. We're talking about from 27 on. And a guy called Pierre Kapitsa, who was a big Russian scientist who was passing stuff back to Moscow because there was no war, they were friends and allies and so forth. And it was one line that changed him, and this is what he said to me. He said, I asked why great minds like Pierre Kapitsa believed in communism, Marxism. And he said to Oliphant, do you go to Sunday school? He said, yes. He said, same thing. And that triggered Oliphant on thinking, it's all propaganda, which was a bit unfair to religion, but it opened his mind. But he wasn't going to be your full-on ideologue ever.
So he wouldn't have identified as a communist himself?
No, no way. But he would have identified as anti-fascist, which was his unbelievable motivation as the war emerged. And part of that was 2 German Jewish refugees coming across, Fitz and Perls were their names, coming across and telling him about what was happening in Nazi Germany, and the West had to get its skates on, otherwise the Germans would have the bomb. And they knew all the scientists in Germany who were working flat out to get the bomb at that point. This is 1939. So Oliphant was driven. It was messianic. He wasn't Jewish, but you'd think he was, the way he was driven to stop the Nazis. It was phenomenal. I've never read anyone who was more feverish about stopping fascism at that point. Of course, he fell in with all the lefties who were on his side in that respect. But it was more the motivation of what they were doing in Germany and having first-hand experience knowing these refugees. And he put them to work on the bomb.
And he, of course, wasn't getting the information about what was happening in Russia.
No.
When it comes to
it was a panacea. They thought, it's wonderful, Stalin's wonderful.
Yeah.
They were hearing stuff, there were reports coming back and so forth, and they were thinking, that's propaganda from the right.
He said his family was religious. They were Christians, Anglicans. Yeah. But the name Oliphant, where does that come from?
I think it's Swedish to begin with, yes. There's a background there in Sweden, Norway, which didn't get him the Nobel Prize, unfortunately. There you go.
Well, there's a lot of people who miss out on the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, but his was a very strong reason. Yes. We're jumping forward from your questions.
Tell me then, through the 30s, how were Rutherford and Oliphant going in developing the atom bomb? I mean, what was the
that's a useful one to go back to. 1932, Oliphant, because of this driven ability with the laboratory, he discovered...
And this is the Cavendish laboratory.
At the Cavendish
at Cambridge
University.
Yeah.
So he discovered that there were 3 elements of hydrogen. First of all, they knew about hydrogen. Let's call them 1, 2, and 3, otherwise it gets silly. But
it's not a science podcast, it's a history podcast, so we won't get bogged down.
No, hydrogen 2 and hydrogen 3. The third one was called tritium, which was used in bombs later on, but that was hydrogen 3. So he discovered those. This was huge. He and Rutherford was sort of the supervisor. That's the way it worked. He would come in and check everything and do the edit, and they were well ahead of the pack in that stage when a lot of people were splitting the atom and doing certain things with getting inside the atom. But Oliphant was absolutely mesmerised by all that. And he eventually wrote a paper that was published in the Bible for scientists, Nature, on thermonuclear fusion. Now, that's the hydrogen bomb. So this is 1934. We know he developed the atomic bomb, which is much smaller still deadly. But he developed what was known later as the hydrogen bomb, which was picked up when the Americans began to look at it in the late 40s to get ahead of the Russians in the mad race, in the race to be the top country in the world with bombs.
And in terms of you referred to just before, to the exchange of information between Britain and
Sweden,
Russia and
everyone.
Sweden.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it was going back to Germany as well.
Yes.
So, I mean, how was this viewed, or was this just...
Well, it was a collegiate thing. I discovered very little, if any, jealousy about papers and things. They all expounded. If you wrote for Nature, everyone got hold of it and then tried to develop further. They were a collegiate group, the physicists particularly, more than any other science group, because it was the big thing, splitting the atom at that stage. And they got a little bit ahead of themselves. When you read the papers, they thought they were superior to governments. Why should we be stopped on anything? Oliphant was at the forefront of that.
Was the British government, for example, monitoring their activities and monitoring in the 1930s whether this research was being taken outside of Britain?
They didn't have a clue.
Right.
By 39, 40, when he was pushing, just shows you how much they didn't have a clue. Oliphant had 2 labs within one. It wasn't a big space, but he had 2 things happening in one laboratory. One on radar, and the government knew about that, of course. And they said, what's happening with uranium? Well, it doesn't matter about that. And when Fritz and Perls came over, they weren't allowed, the Jewish immigrants, they weren't allowed to work on radar because the government said, radar's very important. So Oliphant just shifted across to the nuclear side, which the government knew nothing about. This is right up until about 41, this mentality about bombs. It was unknown. In fact, the Germans were probably level at that point, but they didn't have Oliphant.
Yeah.
And Oliphant drove these 2 brilliant physicists because what all the great scientists were saying, as I said before, you need 100 tons to blow up anything. To fire off U-235, the isotope that is the fissionable fuel, the fuel for the bomb, you need 100 tons. And Oliphant said, no, we can get it down to under a ton, which means we can put it in a plane and drop it on somebody.
Right.
And they said, it can't be done. Everyone, all of them, Einstein too. Don't forget Einstein was a theoretician, as was Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, by the way, was at the Cavendish 6 months before Oliphant and was thrown out because he was hopeless. He couldn't work he wouldn't put up the equipment. He hated the laboratory. I'm a genius. Well, he was pretty smart. And he ended up working on black holes, of all things, with Max Born in Germany. He didn't want to be involved. In fact, he hated his tutor, a guy called Blackett, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and he tried to kill him by poisoning an apple. It's the only bit the film got right about Oppenheimer. Total rubbish apart from that. But they got that right. And he also tried to strangle his best friend in a fit of pique. He went through a period where they sent him off to a psychiatrist in London, in Harley Street, of course, and he said, he's schizophrenic. You're schizophrenic. And he said, no, I'm not. And then he said, I'm not, and something else. And it was a manic depression moment for him.
Bipolar.
So they hadn't diagnosed things like bipolar at that point. And he left in disgrace, basically, from the Cavendish, which Oliphant became the superstar at.
So where was Rutherford then in Oliphant's rise? Was he always overseeing Oliphant's work? Or
he took on Oliphant all the time because Oliphant was the best experimenter.
They parted company a bit towards the end, didn't
37.
they? Yeah.
Well, only because there were 2 reasons. First of all, Oliphant wanted to take on his own position in a laboratory at Birmingham. And Rutherford was really distressed that he was leaving because he realised he's the best protégé he'd ever had, no matter who they were. And he hated that. And also they fought over what was being done with the bomb. Remember, Rutherford was 30 years older.
Yeah.
And he said, we can't go too far in the bomb. We don't know what's going on. They had prescience about it. Same as Einstein, who said, don't get into that. Don't get into that. And Oliphant was the driven character who said, we have to get into it. We've got to get into it. He wasn't thinking about the Nazis at that point. This was 37. But 2 years later, he was. And
so why was he so driven? Just because he was curious, or?
Well, he was a scientist. He wanted to,
but not for any patriotic fervour, or
not at that point.
No,
but then it became massive. Yeah. This whole concept of defeating the fascist empires, including Japan. He spoke a lot about this.
He does move to Birmingham to work on radar.
Yes.
Tell me about how that impacted his career and his work, the Birmingham move.
Well, it was very important because he was free of the parent.
Yes.
in a way,
Yes.
and that's what Rutherford was to him. And he had his own show, and he didn't have to be restricted by. Rutherford hated developing with the scientific equipment, and Oliphant said, no, we're going to do it. We're going to get bigger. We're going to get an atom smasher like no other. They were all the big ones were all into atom smashers, and he was the biggest at that point. There was one other in America we'll come to, but and he wanted the cyclotron, it was called, and the whole thing was smashing atoms, get inside it. And he wanted to go up the chain. The higher up the chain you go with the elements, uranium is heavy. You get up into that area, that's the big mystery. What do you do when you bombard uranium? What happens? So he went into that field. Then he was diverted by radar and the bomb in the war. So he didn't go as far as he'd like to with the cyclotron, but he went far enough in developing the atomic bomb. This is the fascinating bit. He's the man that got the whole concept to Churchill. Everyone else said it can't be done. Then he said it can be done, and he got these two guys, Fritz and Perls, working on a paper. They delivered, and they were even unsure what was happening, and they published it in a very obscure magazine the Nazis wouldn't read. They published it, really weird stuff. It's not like today. Something like that would be all over the net, but this was a break for them. And Oliphant said, right, now do the paper in English and I'll edit it. And he worked with them all the time. As in
plain English?
He played Rutherford with them.
Yeah.
He played Rutherford, and they developed this thing, and then he had to put it up to all the bureaucrats and stuff, and it went on for months. And he finally got in front of 30 of them. Remember at this stage, the Blitz is happening. They're being bombed all the time. Oliphant goes into his study.
So this is 1940?
1940, 41.
Yeah.
Oliphant goes into his study, and there's a bomb's come through the roof and lodged, a big fat bomb lodged behind the bookcase. So he should have been killed a few times. And
was this in London?
This is in
Birmingham, right?
And in London they were being bombed as well. Yeah. So he was very cognizant of what the Nazis were doing and trying to do. So he was driven to stop it. Yes. He didn't get under the desk. He said, we can do this. This is where he really departs from others, because he said, there's a lot of talk about how to beat them, and he said, get this bomb. So he gets in front of about 30 bureaucrats, scientists and politicians in Burlington House in Piccadilly. You probably know it. And the bombs are going, not at that stage, it was the middle of the day, but they were going to go again that night. He said, look, we've got to get this up to whom? And one chap said, oh, the War Office? He said, yes, but who in the War Office? And someone said, Churchill? He said, yes, Churchill. And he said, what you've delivered, after he'd done all the heavy lifting, and to keep everyone happy on the bureaucratic side, they had to put a paper together. So all the scientists had to do it. And it was 30 pages. And he said, look, it's got graphs, it's got uber calculus, it's got this. Churchill's brilliant, but he is not going to, he'll just throw this in the waste paper basket.
Yeah.
3 pages, he said, gentlemen, you've got to get it down. I'll help. And he said, and this is the quote I loved, being an Oz who lived in there 12 years, he said, and it must be in English. Now, to those in front of him, remember that they were very highly qualified people, all of them. This was insulting, but because Oliphant was Oliphant, they all knew that he was the greatest at that point. They had to take it. They didn't like him in many respects. A lot didn't, because he was, I've said this rather stupidly in a way, Ron Barassi on steroids, when he wanted something done. He was dynamic and articulate. And so he got the paper. He basically wrote the 3 pages, got up to Churchill. I haven't got a cigar. Have you got a cigar?
No, sorry.
I was going to do that.
It's a no-smoking campus here.
Churchill read it and he said, I thought we had enough explosives. He said, I suppose one more wouldn't do any harm. Something along those lines. So that was the green light.
Yes.
Right, that was on for them. One problem, they didn't have any money. They're strapped because they're trying to fight off the Luftwaffe. They've got all sorts of problems. And they said, we've got to get them funding from the Americans, who are sitting there inert because no one's bombing them, mouthing politically. And you've got Joseph Kennedy and the ambassador to London saying, well, the Nazis can win. It doesn't matter to us. We don't need to lose boys over there. This went on. And this attitude from the Americans was, it's their problem. We'll pay lip service to it. I'm paraphrasing, but this is basically it when you read all the literature. So Oliphant was sent over to rectify this. Yeah. He got no traction at all from the government, all the bureaucratic scientists who were there. Allegedly.
Even though he's had the tick-off from Churchill?
Well, yes, that's
but
green
with no
light,
funding.
but they had to read what it was all about.
Right.
And what happened was it was sent over to a guy that FDR had set up a small commission to look at this bomb thing, and this guy, Lyman Briggs, who was an agriculturist, had no idea of physics. He stuck it in a safe and locked it and didn't tell anyone. So Oliphant gets there and he sounds like a lunatic talking about a bomb that's going to save the planet and go save the West and all the rest. And he gets no traction and they virtually write him off saying, oh, no, it's not going to happen. He goes to his best mate in America, who was a guy called Ernst Laurie, and he was a big atom smasher. He had his own cyclotron. Mm-hmm. So they spoke the same language and were very good mates. And so he's explaining it one day in his study at Berkeley University.
So he's travelled over to America at this stage.
He travelled over in a bomber. It was very dangerous at that time. But he was absolutely fearless the whole time. He just went boom, 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 you know. Anyway, he got down to California, went and saw Lawrence, and he's explaining it to him, and in walks J. Robert Oppenheimer. Sits down, listens to the discussion, and at one point he interrupts Oliphant and said, should you be talking about this? And Oliphant says, you don't know about this, do you? You and Fermi, who's talking about a great Italian physicist who was in America, you don't even know anything about it. We need you. We need the funding. Get with it, sort of thing. I mean, in a very direct way. Lawrence was on his side, on Oliphant's side. Oppenheimer got a bit of a shock because he didn't have a clearance because of the commie connection, but he was still involved everywhere, but he didn't have quite the clearance. And so Oliphant wrote a paper for Lawrence and Oppenheimer, and that got up the chain slowly, but it got up to Roosevelt eventually, and we're talking about a year or so. But in the meantime, 70 days after he'd confronted Oppenheimer in a way and said, why don't you know about this? This is important. What happens?
Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. Well put. And then suddenly they've got an experience of being bombed and in danger. And they all get together. There's a lot of claptrap about, Einstein's told Roosevelt, total rubbish. Einstein wasn't going to back a bomb, as we've talked about before. And their government just sidelined all that stuff. It was tokenism about Einstein.
It seems, the way you tell it, it seems extraordinary that the UK had the opportunity, but through sort of some bureaucratic bungling, the agriculture bureaucrat putting it in a drawer, and then obviously the lack of funding, they shut themselves off what might have been a faster exit out of the war.
Well, no, they did all they could. They'd done all they could, and they sent over Ron Barassi on steroids to fix up everything with the Americans. They didn't know anything about it. He got rebuffed. Said, you shouldn't be talking about this, some rubbish like that to him. And he took it very well, but he then went and saw Lawrence, and who understood immediately, because he was an atom smasher, what it all meant. So then it got up to Roosevelt eventually. But there's one step back for the Australian audience, and that is that the ambassador to the US, the first ever ambassador, was...
It was
Dick Casey.
Yes, Dick Casey. Yes. I should have known that. Our first minister to Washington.
One of Menzies' top boys. And he was pretty brilliant, Dick, on every level. I call him Dick. I mean, he was Sir Richard, he was Lord Casey eventually.
Yes,
but at the same time, he was a dick at that point, right? So he meets Oliphant. Oliphant goes to him and he says something about the energy machine. He didn't mention the bomb, but he talked about nuclear energy and what it could mean to Australia.
Right.
So he goes to Curtin, who's his Prime Minister. This is 41, remember. This is the time that Oliphant was over there trying to sell it to the Americans. And Casey goes to Curtin and explains very well what it's all about. Curtin wants to back it because he's in the middle of the Japanese attacking, in 42 that is, and he suddenly realises that they have to have a weapon themselves, but they're not going to get it. And the country is in dire straits at that point. So Ben Chifley learns about it, and when Curtin dies, he backs it. He wants the bomb. But going back to Roosevelt first, by the middle of 43, Roosevelt's worried because he sees the funding is going to be massive. It's the biggest government expenditure in history of any government anywhere, including the Greeks, in Athens. It's massive, and he's, what's going to happen? Is it going to work? No one can tell him it's going to work. And so he is worried. And so you remember did you see the film Oppenheimer?
I did.
Right.
Yes.
So you've got the meeting with a general, and the one missing person was Oliphant. So you've got one Englishman in there, Chadwick, and you've got Oppenheimer, and the missing person, the ex, was Oliphant. And General Leslie Groves realises how important Oliphant is because Oppenheimer is desperately trying to get him to go to Los Alamos because he knows this guy will break through anything, will be the backstop for everything, will understand all the experimentation. So remember, Oppenheimer is only the manager. He's not the director of the whole program. This was misconstrued in the film, really, or deliberately, I don't know what. So at the end of the meeting, it goes like this. Oliphant says, I'm not coming to Los Alamos. I'll go occasionally. And they get a bit of a shock. He said, I'm going to go to Berkeley and help Lawrence. And they said, well, why? He said, he's going to make the bomb fuel. You can't run a car without fuel. You can't run a car. The bomb won't work. He said, I can get 5 engineers to make the casing for the bomb in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And they get a bit stunned. And he agrees to go to Los Alamos occasionally. Then Groves pulls him out of the meeting and says, will you please go and see the president and explain? He said, but you've got Oppenheimer. He said, he's part of our team. You're an outsider in a way. Finally, Oliphant goes in, has 1 hour with Roosevelt, and that's it. The green light comes from the other side. They have the Manhattan Project. It's on.
Wow.
That's how powerful Oliphant was.
Yeah. So he's obviously a very good communicator then. If he's
tremendous.
able to have created the 3-page paper to go to Churchill
It's amazing.
and have that accepted.
Well, he understood that they wouldn't understand the hieroglyphics of physics. You know, that's ridiculous to think that someone like Churchill would bother.
Does he keep a diary of his meeting with Roosevelt? Is there a...
He told me about it and he gave me some notes on it, but I don't know if he wrote much about it. He would have mentioned it in some of the papers that he was involved in for sure. But I got that meeting from other sources as well that they'd had and that he had to go in and tell Roosevelt, you've got to do this. Don't worry about the cost, just do it. He had that sort of direct mentality. And that won them over and the Manhattan Project was on.
Did he have concerns about the lethality of nuclear weapons and obviously the impact of radiation and that?
Well, he was the only one, to answer your second part of that question, he was the only one of the great physicists that raved on about radiation being a massive problem. This was something, why did he do that? He'd been in the lab. All the theorists putting it on the board said, yes, there's gamma rays and all sorts of things. He's in the lab having little atomic reactions. Some people, they could see the bones of their hands after working in the lab. He knew what radiation was, and he always, every corollary was, radiation's got to be looked at when you're using these weapons.
Yeah.
Huge in it. You asked about his misgivings morally on it, yes?
Yes.
None.
Yeah.
Do you know why? Kill or be killed.
Right. Yes.
How many Chinese had died at that point? 24 million, right? Do you think the Chinese were sitting around saying, how can we stop the Japanese? We can't use a bomb. Oh, no. Of course. It was kill or be killed. There was no morality. There was no reflective academic rubbish written about at that point because they had to stop the Nazis and then they had to stop the Japanese, who would not have been stopped unless the emperor capitulated, and he was heavily involved. So it was hard for him to capitulate. We wanted to hang him and MacArthur said, no, we keep him because that'll cause more disruption in Japan. But when he said it's over, it was over. But nothing can be said that convinced me anything else that they would have just gone on to the last baby fighting in the islands. And I'm glad that he did capitulate.
Oliphant's career was largely in the UK. He's obviously
23
spent
years.
a little bit of time in the US during this period. But, he is an Australian. And you said he had influence over Curtin and Chifley when it came to nuclear power as well.
Yes.
Did he think Australia should have pursued its own nuclear weapon as well? Australia was
that's
also
one of the great
basic.
issues. One of the great issues that come out of the book and the research, and that is in 1946, he'd got to know Doc Everett at the United Nations as Oliphant. He hadn't met Chifley. Curtin was dead. And he knew Nugget Coombs, who was the greatest economist, a bureaucrat at that point. So they had a little delegation of the triumvirate running Australia, Evan, Chifley and Coombs, who went to London to convince him to come back to Australia.
Yeah.
Why did they want that? Stockpile atomic weapons.
Yeah.
Now, it's not, you'll see something in the archives of the Labor Party, but it happened. There's a lot of evidence for it on paper. And they didn't know much more on nuclear energy. And that had been given to them by Dick Casey. They called it the energy machine. But they said, can you give us a defensive weapon? He said, oh, yes, that's what I call turnkey an operation. It's screwdriver ready. Once you get the nuclear power industry going, you can screwdriver ready and have a bomb in he said to me 6 weeks. I think it takes longer, but he was an optimist and he was driven. So if he'd been in charge of doing it, it probably would have been 6 weeks.
Well, and hence all the concerns around Iran's nuclear energy industry.
Well, they're a bit slower. They're a bit more retarded, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But here's Oliphant at this time confronted by the Labor people saying they wanted the bomb. And why? Because all of our grandparents and great-grandparents and what have you were fretting over the fact another Asian nation might come back down and do it again to us. So it was a natural reaction at that point in time to stockpile atomic weapons. Now, the contradiction everyone thinks is a contradiction, it's not, is that Oliphant fought against having the hydrogen bomb, which he'd created the paper for in 1934. All the great scientists who are watching this, go and get the Nature paper, read it and comprehend what was on the actual drawing board at that point in 1934. So he said no, because that's just going to mean everyone will get one and it'll be Third World War. He didn't actually use the words at that point, mutually assured destruction, but we discussed that. And he said, well, it has worked after a fashion, but he wasn't for hydrogen weapons. But he was for Australia because what had happened to him, he'd been in the Blitz, being hammered. He should have died at least twice. Then he comes back to Australia in 1942 for a quick visit, and he goes to Sydney. The Japanese have got mini-subs, and they killed 21 British sailors on a ship. And he's then thinking Australia must be defended. So it was very flattering in 1946 when the delegation went over. Chifley worked on him very hard. They walked around Hyde Park together and he was flattered. I mean, here's the country he'd love, but he's in a much more powerful position in England. And what happened? He couldn't go. He's building Harwell, which is their atomic reactor industry south of Cambridge. And Attlee said, no, you've got a 4-year contract. You can't go back. So he couldn't get back till 1950. And, of course, by then Menzies and the Labor government would have been exactly the same. We'll have the ANZUS Treaty, which was being drawn up at that point in 1950. It wasn't signed yet, but was drawn up. And the Americans were saying, there's an American umbrella. You don't have to have spending massive amounts of money down under.
Well, that also
to have a nuclear weapon. That you don't need it. We'll back you.
And also because of Cold War concerns, the Americans were shutting foreigners out of their own programs. So they
had shut out the Brits, which, by the way, upset Oliphant because he knew the brilliant tech had come from England to develop the bomb. He'd been part of that, the number one star in that, and they were rebuffing him and saying, well, we'll go our own way after the war,
Just backtracking a bit, though. I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened in August 1945, thus causing the Japanese emperor to surrender and the end of the Pacific War. Does Oliphant reflect on that in any great way? He just thought that was sort of the natural progression of the war?
I said you had no moral qualms when it happened. But, of course, seeing the results and the problems with radiation, which he had warned about, and he'd said, I want this demonstrated on an island near Japan. I don't want, but he didn't have a say. By that time, he's back in England. He's done his bit for the bomb, and he didn't have a say. He got a shock. He was on holidays in England when they said report back on Monday where there's something going to be discussed. And, of course, it was this propaganda about the new atomic age. And he's wheeled out with 3 other great scientists for television. They did have it, radio and newspapers, massive media coverage. And he's the only one that comprehended what had happened in the sense of what it could be. He didn't know. He didn't have any detail. The Americans were going to hide it. It was only Wilfred Burchett, an Australian communist journalist, who went on a train to Hiroshima and wrote about the destruction. He wasn't a scientist. It wasn't a scientific report, but he was honest in that respect. He was anti-American, but that's neither here nor there. The report was honest, and he described all the radiation sickness and people dying and so forth. And Oliphant then he understood fully what he'd done, but the morality of it was that they had to be stopped. And I think he lived with that. But, of course, the opprobrium sat with those who'd created the weapon for a long time, and that's why he did not get the Nobel Prize. It was put up for both radar separately, the radar development in war, and for the bomb, the nuclear physics. And the Swedish Academy said, and the Norwegian said, oh, no, no, we can't have the creator of the atomic weapon getting a Nobel Prize. So the one who deserved it most at Cambridge had it declined. I discussed it with him. It didn't rankle with him, but he would have liked another little badge like that.
Of course.
Menzies had made him a knight in 1959.
Yeah, so tell me about his relationship with the Menzies government.
Yeah, it was good. He
was offered a knighthood earlier than 59, though, wasn't he, in 52?
He was knocked back earlier, but when Menzies offered it in 59, 10 years after he'd been in office, Menzies was 49, wasn't he? 49, Menzies?
Yes.
Yeah, 10 years after he offered it, and he took it because he'd got to know Menzies a bit and admired him, and it coloured him a lot about the fact that someone of that stature was running the country. And he'd loved Doc Evatt, but Evatt blew himself away by saying he'd written a letter to Molotov asking if there were any spies in Australia. And Molotov said, no, there are no Russians, no KGB operatives in Australia. I mean, for God's sake, that killed his career. But he was a very bright barrister, a brilliant man, and he was friends with Oliphant. Oliphant had a lot of time for him. Also Menzies, he just saw what a great person he was, of great stature. So they got on very well. And Menzies made an effort to understand Oliphant. That was a good thing.
But in terms of the progress towards nuclear energy that obviously came to naught in the end, I mean, Oliphant was quite involved in advising the Australian government.
Then because I grew, well, I was in England for 12 years, and Lord Rothschild, who'd been a spy for forget that side of it, was pushing nuclear energy all the time. And I'm looking at all the detail thinking, this is a bit dodgy, maybe a bit premature. I didn't know, I wasn't a scientist, but I thought it was a bit odd. And then the free energy element came up very much, and the security of it after Chernobyl and all the rest of it. There were still 3 Mile Island and other problems, and the one in Japan recently shows the issues that can happen, but it seemed to be the best energy. Now, I'm not going to go into what I know about energy coming, but it's going to supersede nuclear energy. This method called cold fusion, which was introduced to me by Oliphant, I didn't understand it at that time. It was one of the last things we talked about. And he said, it's going to be a new tech. It's going to give free energy, and it's going to be at the molecular level. And it wasn't until 20 years later, 30 years later, I was introduced to all that. But that aside, nuclear energy is the best bet for the country, and it's still being debated. And, of course, both sides have dropped away from it, basically. What a contradiction. Here was the Labor Party, really on their knees for Oliphant to develop it. And it didn't happen because both parties, Menzies wasn't alone in this, said, the Americans are going to protect us. Well, that's true for a certain amount of time. We're in a different era now. We don't know what's in front of us.
There was also, of course, during the 50s and 60s, a sense that we had abundant coal and we could create energy using coal, and that was cheap, rather than going down the nuclear energy route, which was inevitably going to be very expensive.
I know, but nuclear energy, I happen to know a bit about what's happening with the coal industry, and, it's dirty coal because you're getting carbon off, and that's going to be...
But not in the 50s and 60s. Those concerns
no, they didn't care about that.
So, the impetus for nuclear energy in Australia wasn't strong when you had coal, which was just so easy.
It wasn't. And the fact that we had protection from the Americans, we had to sidle up with them in Vietnam and Korea and everything else, which was a willing thing. But it was, if we'd had our own weaponry, we might have said, we don't need to do this. We can stop them our own way.
What about Oliphant's views on the British nuclear tests at
he was very much against those, because that's moving into areas beyond what he developed.
Yes.
And it was done in secret, and he was kept out of it because he was under pressure from the CIA. The CIA had a file on him at the stage and were telling our politicians, don't let him get involved because he's passing it under the Russians, Well, that's all. Maybe. He's a pinko, was the word.
Did you get a sense that he ever passed anything to the Russians?
Well,
for nefarious reasons. He might have for research reasons.
He was like a lot of scientists at that time, Oppenheimer included. They were dealing with the Russians, right? So, and Churchill was dealing with the Russians. Right. So in Oliphant's eyes, he didn't like what was happening. You see, he was being rebuffed when he was making the actual bomb himself, but he was involved in Las Almas and at Berkeley. He hated the way he was being treated, and he was worried that the Americans would do what they did do, and that's just jettison the UK side. And so he was during the war, I mean, he had 5 people who ended up spying, passing material on, working for him, several at Birmingham, including Klaus Fuchs, who became the famous one. But it was Oliphant that didn't make a meal of this in the book. It was sort of a tertiary strand. I think it's more important to understand what he did with the bomb, radar. But a third thing that developed as I wrote, and I have a very strong, probably stronger background in espionage of that time than anyone in this country, I thought, well, I'm not going to go there because it's not the main thing, but it developed as the main thing in the 100,000 words you write. So a main thing, put it that way. So he was responsible for putting these spies in key places in Canada and the US, and they were passing it on to the Russians. Now, how do I know that? Because I interviewed in Moscow 2 of the great spies of that era, Russians, KGB, that was Yuri Ivanovich Modin and Vladimir Barkovsky, on camera, as we're now doing, in Moscow.
Right.
So they were telling me certain things about how they got information, and they weren't saying Oliphant was behind it. But
so there's no suggestion that Oliphant was directing this in order to help the Soviet Union.
I'm not sure about that. I mentioned in the book. Because
so you think it's an open question whether he was a Soviet spy?
It's more than an open question. I think he was very keen for the Russians to know what was happening and to not fall behind the Americans. He was worried about the Americans. He still had a weird view of the Russians because, let's face it, Stalin had backed 20 million people who died against the Nazis. So in Oliphant's big brain, and he knew all the great scientists in Russia from before the war, he's thinking the Russians aren't that bad. I mean, his attitude wasn't they should have the bomb. So you've got a little scoop here.
He's never exposed as a KGB, operative or an agent.
Okay, you put 2 and 2 together. You say, here's the man that says to Klaus Fuchs, you go to New York and you're there. Yeah. So he meets the control, which is Vladimir Barkovsky, that I had interviewed at length on other things, right? And he meets him, right? And then the Russians get a certain amount of material on this area. Then the other 3 or 4, Oliphant's directed where they go. He didn't just say, we can have 4 scientists. He pulled one guy called Burrup, Burrup, out of Melbourne. He was a communist, and stuck him in the Manhattan Project. Now, he was never charged, but he was on the list of possible agents, and the others were agents. Klaus Fuchs, for example, he's the great example. So he gets caught by MI6, and where has Oliphant put him? He's put him into Harwell, the atomic energy area in England, which Oliphant had created or been the main force. You'll see other names come up. Just believe me, the force was, you've got to have the bomb on your own. I know what the Americans are like, what they're doing. So even though a couple of great scientists, one of them Chadwick, who were behind that, Oliphant was a driving force. So he puts Klaus Fuchs there after the war
so
into
you're
the 40s.
sort of basically suggesting that Oliphant might have been the puppet master here.
That's a good way of putting it. That's a very graphic way of putting it, but I think so. So. I mean, if you read the book closely, here he is directing what happens. Then he's upset about the Americans. Then he's really upset about the Americans. They've pulled away from the Brits in nuclear development. He starts Harwell, which is their great nuclear facility. That's reactors and the capacity, quietly to stockpile weapons, which they began doing, of course. So he's the man who's put Klaus Fuchs there. Now, I did get hold of some MI6 tapes, which were rather funny, because he's being interviewed with Pearls, one of the Jewish emigres that came over, and they're talking about, what a shock it is, and this is the tape, that Klaus got caught, sort of thing, and it had nothing to do with us. I mean, Oliphant is a little transparent there, not aggressively saying it, but said, of course, we don't know anything about it, but isn't it funny that he's been caught?
Yes.
And you sort of go, this is too dodgy to be true. So I would think puppet master is not a bad description.
Yeah. So you felt that interview was a bit contrived. They were, playing to the camera or at least the recording device. At that point,
but the fact that he put all these key people in, he had another one called Alan Nunn May, Nunnn May, who was someone in Birmingham who's working under him. So he had all these great scientists, and he's shoveling them across to the Manhattan Project.
So the CIA's watching him in the 50s.
They began to watch him. It's really near the end of the war at that point.
Yeah, and then through the 50s.
Yes. Oh, yes.
He's banned from entering the United States.
Has no visa for at least a decade, I think it was. About
what changes? Is it
what
because
changes?
He's out of,
the politics changed. The whole Oppenheimer thing was over. He was virtually disgraced and out of it. They were mates, by the way, and I believe if Oliphant had gone over to testify, he would never have lost his clearance or been ostracised the way he was, because Oliphant would have said, look, we got the bomb. This man helped me. I helped him. We got the bomb. That stopped the Japanese, and it would have stopped the Nazis. It just coincidence it didn't, in a way. I think he would have put the case very strongly that, Oppenheimer should not have been dismissed in disgrace for his communist affiliations. Now, it doesn't mean that Oliphant was a communist, but he looked at it on a broader scale. He loved the whole collegiate idea. So why shouldn't the Russians have the nuclear weapons? And then MAD comes up, mutually assured destruction. And I think Oliphant definitely was thinking that way into the 50s, there's no doubt. Now, you'll notice in the book he goes over to Russia and they fate him.
Right.
Kapitsa, who's now living in Moscow, says, oh, yes, he's great. We'll give him a medal. And, he got a medal. He wouldn't let me see the medal, but he's got some medal. And you think, well, he slid over to them. He made some oblique remarks over the years about, they don't have to worry about government finance. They just they get tax loads of money to build the great cyclotron. So his brain's already in there. They've got a bigger atom smashing than I ever had.
So you're saying, well, he obviously was a US skeptic.
Oh, very much.
He
hated them, basically. Hated their attitude.
He was
not individually
sympathetic to Russia, and obviously very admiring of Russian scientists and Russian know-how.
Well, they knew what he'd given them. You've got to understand.
But do you think his he was very interested in the science over the politics? Was that what you would say?
Still, and I'll give you...
And do you think that's why he wasn't sort of caught?
Wasn't caught. He was never... I'm saying it after summarising a book of his life, which no CIA agent would do the research I've done into his life and find out every little chasm that he's been in and what his thinking was. Just to jump forward, he did change his mind about the Russians. I interviewed him in 1994. He was 92 years old, as cogent as anyone you'll ever meet.
Amazing.
Unbelievable. That's why I wrote the book eventually. And he was talking about that, and he didn't like... He got a bit of a shock when Hungary happened. Scientists had nothing to do with that. That's Khrushchev in 1956. Then they go into Czechoslovakia in 1968, and by that stage, he's realising the pro-Stalinist mentality has gone all wrong, or it is wrong, and it was probably wrong in the 1930s when he was imbued with it.
Right.
So he did...
And is he still actively working by this stage in the 1960s, late 60s?
Yeah, he was. He was in Australia. He was running the ANU. He created, effectively, was the key player. Flora, who you mentioned before, said to him, don't go. You're mad to go. You have much better life here. They respect you. You've got everything at your feet. And Oliphant did want to do something, altruistically for his country, and he didn't get the opportunity in the way he wanted, because everyone, you imagine a little country town with, sheep and cows and everything, and suddenly they've got this giant coming over. They don't know much about what he's done. They haven't read my book. It's 1950. And they go, oh, why is he getting all the funds? He's building this big thing and we're not getting those funds. So the bureaucratic mentality tried to crush him, basically, and keep him out. And he was confrontational. If he wanted things done, he would go in and say, I want this done. And so he did put off a lot of people at that point, but he got what he wanted in the ANU and so forth to a degree, and lectured, which would have been fantastic for physicists at that era. And a lot of physicists grew up with his schooling behind them. He was tremendous. But he would have been at the forefront of anything he wanted in the UK at that point. He was a number one, and he came back here. And, of course, his family was in Adelaide, and his wife, Rosa, I don't think put any pressure on him. She was fantastic. She went with the flow, understanding the big picture all the time of what he was doing. But there would have been that imperative, I've been away 23 years, can I give something back to the country?
Yes.
And it would have been nuclear energy, which didn't come off, nuclear reactors didn't come off, and bombs didn't come off. And here we are, 80 years after Chifley and co were begging him for it, and I think Menzies would have been right in there at that point, until ANZUS, and then Menzies said, quite rightly, and so did the Labor Party, we don't need to expend billions.
John Gorton, who takes over from Harold Holt in 1967, when Harold Holt unfortunately drowns, he's a big advocate for nuclear energy, and Oliphant does advise
Oliphant was there,
him.
but on Screes here, and he was saying, It was Gorton who went to him, though, to be fair, and said, look, what do you think? He said, we can still do it. You can build a nuclear industry, nuclear reactors, and you can have a spin-off of bombs and then no one will threaten us. You only have to have 5 or 10 with missiles. They're going to have missiles. All the development at Woomera had been with rockets and missiles, and so they were right onto that technology. We have had a lot of great scientists who've never seen fulfilment in these areas, nuclear energy.
Yes.
They've just died off, basically. And we're back to square one. We're back to 1945 right now with, neither government really pushing hard enough for nuclear industry. And looking at it from outside, I'm saying, well, there is new technology. Can we hang on for that, which is going to change everything anyway? But no one knows much about it, so it's not going to have the impact immediately.
Roland, do you think the reason we don't acknowledge Oliphant is because of his connection to nuclear weapons and Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I think
that
in
it's all a bit,
terms, yes.
uncomfortable for us?
Yes.
Or is it this potential that he was caught up in Russian espionage,
I don't
Soviet
think we
espionage?
cared about that.
No?
Australia didn't care about it. We had Asia who did care about it because they had to be seconded by Big Brother to watch him as well. There are files on Oliphant, or files on CIA, files on him, and he didn't get his visa to the States, which is ridiculous, but they didn't give it to him. So that's an element. But in general terms, he's just been forgotten. The opprobrium of the bomb has clouded a lot of thinking and a lot of reflection on him. And then I'd interviewed him at length, and I was thinking all authors who have a lifetime in it say, oh, well, I'd like to do one on Georgina. She's pretty nice. I'd like to do a book on her. And you put it in the file, and then another 20 things come up. And I thought, I'll never do Oliphant. And then I saw the Oppenheimer film, and I walked out of that movie and I thought, I wanted to scream on the steps.
Yes.
I just want to say, this is such rubbish. It's so fraudulent. We understand him. It's got to be about America. It's got to be about an American in trouble, an American developing things. It wasn't. It's just so ridiculous. Who's the man that got it to Churchill? Who explained it to FDR? And was the key one explaining it to Oppenheimer at the time. And so he didn't want to beat his chest. I mean, I could feel it because I understood him to a point. No one ever understands someone like that fully. He did open up more about his feelings about the weaponry, and he just got back to the, kill or be killed, essentially. Yeah. And he did have, obviously, once he learned about the radiation problems and all those people dying in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that hurt him a lot.
Of course.
But it hurt him more that he was dismissed because of it in history, in a way.
And his twilight years, he spent the rest of his life in Canberra, didn't he? Yeah.
When I interviewed him, one of the last questions, I just couldn't believe he wasn't working for the government in some capacity. And I said, why aren't you working for the government? He said, oh, they've got nothing for me anymore. And it was rather sad. Here's a man that right on top of his game with a perspective going back. He hadn't been working since the late 60s, and of course then he was governor of South Australia.
Roland, what an extraordinary story about an even more extraordinary Australian who deserves to be better known, and obviously your book is making sure that more people do appreciate his contributions and the sort of colourful nature of his life. So thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
Georgina, a great pleasure, and thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.